Hi, my name's Margaret Bridgford and I'm here with you today from Brisbane, Australia as part of the Festival of Rural Women. Thank you for joining me and I hope that what I have to share today will be of some value to you. So I've got a few props with me today just to let you know. I'm sitting in a room in my house and I have some notes with me. I've decided that it would be better for you and me if we had notes so that my structure flows rather than trying to remember everything in my head. I've also got a glass of water in case I need it, and I've brought with me a few books as things that I'd like to show you along the way. I have a tiny little microphone just here, which is my iPhone microphone, and I'm speaking into my iPhone. This is a whole new experience for me, and once I've done this, I'll have to learn how to edit it. So, here we go. So the title of my presentation is Turning Points and Tipping Points. And the subtitle is 3 lessons that I have learned whilst blooming where I've been planted. To turning points and tipping points. We all have them. I think they usually appear when they're least expected. And I suspect that some of them we don't even recognise until they've well gone. I've learned a lot in my life from my turning points and tipping points, and I'd like to share a couple with you today. So first, a little background so you know who you're speaking with. I was brought up in Australia and have lived most of my life in rural, regional and remote Australia, starting off in Burra in South Australia, and then Kingaroy in the South Burnett in Queensland, and then right up to the tip of northern Australia in Cape York to a mining town called Weipa, and then ultimately to Dalby on the Darling Downs, 3 hours west of Brisbane, and now happily settled in Brisbane. My father always brought us up with the notion that we needed to bloom where we were planted. I'm most grateful to him for having instilled this lesson in us. It's allowed me to live and work in a range of environments comfortable in my own skin. And it was in fact the theme of, it is in fact the theme of Rebel's conference, Blooming Where You're Planted, that drew me to want to participate when Rebel invited me, because it so reflected early learning in my life. And I really congratulate Rebel for putting this together. It's been an enormous challenge for her. 3 days of speakers, all with our own technology, all with our own presentations, and I'm sure if you've tapped into a few of the speakers along the way, you'll be really pleased with the information you've been able to glean. And I hope that's no different today. So now to my adult life and to time on our farm. While we were still in our 20s, Bill and I made a conscious decision to move to the farm and to live and work on the family farm. We'd both been employed in Brisbane, we were both university educated, and we made that choice consciously to move to the farm and spend our lives there. Having made that huge decision, then we had to make it work. It had to work professionally and it had to work personally. And as is true for many farming families, we functioned in the traditional division of labour, where Bill was essentially responsible for the success of our farming business, and I was essentially responsible for our family and our community activities. We made this choice consciously and we were both really comfortable with it. In some ways it worked and in some ways it didn't, and that's probably true of a lot of the choices we make in our life. I think we can only make our choices at the time based on what we know and what we feel, and adapt over time. Early on in this new life that we were forming together, I think I had my very first tipping point. Little, but it was a tipping point. Having made these conscious choices, I started to feel as though with my role not being so defined, I was no longer experiencing the sense of identity that I had had when we were living in the city. I was comfortable socially and professionally, and I had moved to a completely different environment. Although I had been brought up on a farm, rural life was not new to me. It was a new environment for me as an adult, and I had to learn to live in that environment and to learn to function differently to my normal professional role. So that was my minor tipping point, because I started to feel as though I could feel invisible. It wasn't an intentional thing, it was simply one of those things that I felt, and I needed to do something about that. This forced me to think about myself. I felt a little bit of unrest, and I had to work out how I was going to handle it. I still agreed with the model that we had chosen. I just had to work out how my part in it was going to function. This led to a turning point in how I could progress happily in this new life, and indeed in life in general. The turning point for me was when I realised that in order for others to value me, I first of all must value myself. In order for others to value me, I first of all must value myself. I'd grown up with a little bit of the belief that there would be a knight in shining armour who would swoop down and know what was important to me and ensure that my life would be fulfilled. So it was a little confronting when I realised that was not going to be the case. That I, in fact, was responsible for my own life, for its happiness and for its sense of satisfaction. Amazing now when I look back on it. This was confirmed for me when I read a book called The Cinderella Complex by Colette Dowling. It's a fascinating insight into women's fear of independence. For all of us, I believe that a challenge is to achieve our own happiness and satisfaction while still in the company of and being supported by those we love. In many ways, the choices I made at this time were choices that have marked the personal and professional success of my life to date. Valuing myself played out in two significant ways. First of all, I consciously chose the roles I was going to fill, both in our family business and in our community activities. And secondly, I consciously chose the roles I was going to play in those community activities, the positions that I was going to fill in those community committees. And I did this for a very good reason. It might seem a bit paradoxical that I actually chose volunteer positions when I was searching for an identity. I chose them because I wanted to be in control of my own time. We had a family business, we had a family, I had a yearning to be involved in other activities, and yet I didn't want those activities to dominate me and to in fact take away a sense of connection. So by choosing volunteer positions, it actually allowed me to decide the hours I was going to put in, rather than having an employer say to me when I needed to be at work and when I didn't. And when it came to choosing which roles or committee roles or positions I went to, I also had two criteria. The first was that it had to interest me, and the second was that I was going to learn a new skill from it. I didn't fall into the trap of doing something because, well, someone had to do it, or if I didn't, who would? Across a 12-year time frame, I developed a range of skills in those community groups. Practical skills, writing skills, negotiation skills, presentation skills, leadership skills, and critically, I learnt the skill of running an efficient and effective meeting. I learnt how to include people. I learnt how to keep the discussion broad. I learnt how to bring it to a close and to summarise and to move on. I watched what worked and I experimented with different strategies in different situations. I was learning on the job, which is such a valuable part of living and working in communities, in a community group, in a rural community, because generally they're volunteer groups and generally they'll take all comers. So there's always something to do, as we all know, and there's always something to learn. My advice is choose the roles you take on and make sure you learn from them. So I could flip burgers and burn my hand in the local Scout fundraising function as well as the next person. But I didn't do it to learn to flip burgers. I did it because I held some sort of a committee position that I was learning from, and at the same time I was making my personal contribution to the effectiveness and the success of the activity. So throughout this time, I then applied these skills to our industry bodies. Except now, rather than volunteer my services, I now had to be nominated for the positions, not just volunteer myself. And I applied exactly the same criteria. It had to be something that interested me, and it had to be something that I was going to learn from. For example, as is so typical, I never accepted a secretary role in any of the positions. It wasn't something that interested me, and I didn't think I was going to learn very much from it. I accepted all the other roles, but never a secretary role. There was nothing glamorous about it, but it had a purpose for me, and I was contributing at the same time. Communities and community groups are invaluable for these learning skills. What's tricky though is having learned those skills, having them recognised outside of those community groups. Because you don't have the skills on paper, you've just learnt them along the way. And I was keen for these skills to be valued by a wider audience, so that I could take on different roles outside of my community and local industry. For this to happen, I made strategic links. I followed one of Stephen Covey's 7 habits, his circle of influence. I started putting my hand up for committee positions in agri-politics, where I knew people who knew my skills, just at the edge of my circle of influence. And I commissioned a professional CV writer to write my CV as a skills-based CV and not a chronological CV. And I continued to use that to this day. My sister always says that I'm like a cat. I always fall on my feet. And I think she's right, I do. But not before I've done an awful lot of hard work. Twice in my life, I've experienced synchronicity that has had a significant influence in my life. And I believe these moments of synchronicity occurred, and I recognised them because of the hard work I put in beforehand. The first one was a demonstration of what happened as a result of learning to value myself, which I've been referring to at the moment. It wasn't really part of any specific plan that I would start to nominate for these industry positions. It just appeared at the right time when I was ready. This was my first experience of synchronicity. I was in our office on the farm cleaning my desk, throwing things in the bin. And for some reason, my eye was captured by a piece of material I'd thrown in the bin, which was a standard mailer from our local industry body. And I pulled it out of the bin, and listed on that mailer was a number of industry positions which were coming up for nomination. And we'd had the document for probably a month, and it had sat on my desk and I'd thrown it in the bin. By the time I read it, at this time, there was about 2 days left until the nominations closed. 2 of those positions sparked my interest. I didn't have any experience in either of them, but I'd done a lot of work, and I'd become much more skilled than I was when I first arrived on the farm. So I put in an application, and I was nominated for the positions, both of them, and I was successful in achieving both of them. If I hadn't been ready for it, I don't believe that piece of paper would have actually caught my eye. What happened as a result of that, those 2 community positions, was that over a period of time, they snowballed into taking on 3 major industry board roles, and in addition to being accepted into the Australian Rural Leadership Program. And all because I valued myself. The second moment of synchronicity came after a major tipping point in our lives. We'd leased the farm. We were both suffering emotional and physical exhaustion, and in addition, Bill was suffering chronic fatigue. More on that later. For the moment, I really want to focus on synchronicity. We were living in our local coastal hinterland, and I was still on boards and committees, and I decided that I was going to start studying. My boards and committees were going to come to an end because we'd moved from the farm, and I decided to study my Masters of Business. One Saturday I was reading the Weekend Australian, as has become my habit, and I made a choice to flick through the executive positions, which I'd never done before. I remember it as though it was yesterday. I remember where I was sitting, I remember the view, I remember the weather, the time of day, coffee I was drinking, everything. I spotted a particular position that interested me, and so I read the details. And then I read them again. And after I'd read them the third time, I said to myself, I feel really sorry for the other people who apply for this position. It was absolutely written for me. It was incredible. It was really just a matter of going through the process, I thought. And indeed that was true. That job was as CEO for a private education and training company based in Brisbane called Resource Consulting Services, or RCS, as it's known in the marketplace. All my skills that I had developed over all those years made me the perfect candidate for that position, and I was available to do it. Now that's synchronicity. I didn't know it at the time, but the job represented a major turning point in our lives. I started to learn about natural farming systems, about the natural mineral cycles and the water cycles, about tapping into those cycles to regenerate the landscape, using the hooves of intense herds of animals to trample the natural grasses and spread the seeds, fertilising with manure and faeces along the way. About how native grasses actually hold water in the soil, whereas introduced species do not. I learnt and I learnt and I learnt, and the more I learnt, the more inspired I became about the possibilities that these natural farming systems offer our society. I started to reflect on our lifetime of farming using the modern industrial model of high levels of fertiliser, pesticides and insecticides in order to achieve plant growth and still control the weeds and insects at the same time. And the more I learned, the more I realised what we had thought of as a farm and a feedlot was in fact a wheat factory and a cattle factory. It was sobering because it flew in the face of everything that we had stood for in the 50 years that Bill's family had been farming on our land. Although flipping burgers had long been left behind, that was part of the journey that had brought me to that point. I knew I had somewhere more to go with this knowledge, but I didn't know where it was going to be. After 7 years of learning new knowledge, reading, researching, thinking and joining the dots in my own head, I worked out where it was all heading. I needed to write down what I believed I had recognised. I had recognised a mass of connections about man's role on earth and our involvement in disturbing the natural balance to such an extent that it is now at its own tipping point, in my view. Those mass of connections have resulted in my recently published book, Eat, Think, Heal. One family's story of discovering the healing powers of food and thought. Well, that's our family and that's our story. That job in the Weekend Australian that Saturday morning wasn't a turning point for just me. It was a turning point for Bill as well. It relieved him of the pressure of having to provide for our family in his state of health and allowed him to fill his day as he saw fit. It wasn't until 15 years after the event that Bill was able to recognise that his chronic illness had drawn us away from the farm had been created by chemical stress and overwork, and also delivered more stress and anxiety on its own. And in its own way, it had also given us the opportunity to develop this new understanding about nature's powerful practices. It was our intense knowledge of those industrial farming methods and our newly obtained knowledge of natural farming systems that allowed us to recognise the paradoxes and join the dots in a way that not many people would be able to do. With this detailed knowledge and personal experience, I believe now that I have written a book that may indeed be unique in the world. And I don't say that lightly. The content is not unique. What I believe is special about this book is the linkages that I have made and the conclusions that I have drawn from our personal experiences and research. It's my story, it's our personal story, and a lot more with it. It's little, and I'm told it's easy to read. It incorporates not only soil health and human health, but also pleasing evidence that our society is moving away from the linear reductionist thinking to an appreciation that once again the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It includes the power of vibrations of the universe and their impact on our health, the role of the heart brain in informing the cranial brain, now that's a concept, as well as our capacity to listen to the landscape and hear what it is calling for. They're all connected in some way. It's fascinating to think about and to start recognise in your own life. I'm very keen for the information in this book to be shared widely. I encourage you to read it. I believe the content is important for us to think about, and I spent 4 years working through the complex to make it simple. I'd like to take time now to explain some of those paradoxes that I've mentioned in the book. At the same time as our family has been experiencing our tipping points and turning points, so too has Mother Earth. Our family's experience is a microcosm of the larger effect. I believe that man's place on this planet has reached its own tipping point. In our quest to feed more people and create a healthier world, I believe that we've achieved exactly the opposite. With increased chronic illnesses spreading across the world, at the same time as seeing a drastic reduction in the mineral content of the foods we eat. And that's no coincidence. They're connected. And their connection is through our soils. Unwittingly, we've created a situation where the natural interplay between the plant and the soil has been interrupted. This interruption has stopped the natural transfer of carbon from the plant to the soil and of minerals from the soil to the plant. This interruption has occurred because we use artificial fertiliser, which stops that natural interaction. When a plant needs to find its own fertilisation, it sends down carbon from the CO2 that it absorbs in from the atmosphere. It sends the carbon down into the soil, and it sends the oxygen back into the atmosphere. In exchange for that carbon that's come down through the plant into the soil delivers to the plant the minerals that the plant needs for its growth. We benefit from those minerals when we eat the plants that have been grown in this healthy soil. When the plant is being fed an artificial fertiliser, it does not need to access the minerals from the soil for growth, so it doesn't send down the carbon. And there's a consequence. The end result for us is that we don't get the minerals we need for our healthy body. As our cells naturally die off and are replenished, the new cells are not as healthy as the old ones, and so it goes on. The end result for the soil is that it doesn't get the carbon that it needs to replenish itself and grow new soil. The process of decay continues naturally, but there's nothing to replace what has been decayed. This is the most marvellous piece of nature when it is allowed to function, and it is so easy to interrupt. Our interruption of this process with artificial fertiliser has unwittingly placed man and the soils on this earth both under pressure for their survival. Now, isn't that remarkable? You can thank Professor Albert Frank in the 1800s for that discovery, and you can thank Dr. Christine Jones, an Australian soil ecologist, for bringing it to the attention of the world today. I know I'm running out of time, but I have one more area that I'd like to share with you that I have touched on in the book. It's a fantastic piece of research, and I'd like to share it quickly. It's research that shows the power of our thoughts. There are so many different ways to demonstrate the importance of our thoughts to our own health. The one that is the easiest and the most graphic to show is the role of our thoughts on the structure of water crystals. Dr. Emoto has published a series of books about messages in water. His images are extraordinary. There's the book there. Dr. Emoto used a range of different techniques to expose water to different thought patterns. Sometimes he wrapped a piece of paper with the words typed on it around a bottle. Sometimes he conducted group sessions where a whole group of people would combine with focused thought, at the same time either thinking positive thoughts or thinking negative thoughts. No matter which technique Dr. Emoto chose, the same results occurred. Water responds to thoughts, words and emotions of those around it. One of his experiments that I think is so graphic regarding our own health is the one where the water was exposed to a focus of negative, hateful thoughts, compared with water that was exposed to thoughts of love and gratitude. The loving thoughts produced a perfect crystal shape, just like a magnificent piece of jewellery. The hateful thoughts created a distorted, ugly image with no clear form or structure. This is amazing in itself, to think that our thoughts could be so powerful. Take that one step further and consider that our bodies are made up of 70% water. Now what do you think thoughts do for our well-being? I'm not suggesting for a minute that we should never have another negative thought. We'll always have negative thoughts. What I'm suggesting is that we let the thought come and then we let the thought go. Negative thoughts have no place in a healthy body. Positive thoughts are the ones that are inspiring and create a positive future. So my subtitle, as I said, was 3 lessons that I've learned while blooming where I was planted. Well, here's those 3 lessons. The first one, you're probably going to gather. It was when I realised that in order for others to value me, I must first of all value myself. The second lesson is, for me, has been that synchronicity happens when you've already put in the hard work. And the third lesson for me is understanding the powerful choices that nature provides will lead us to a happier, healthier and more connected life. If you'd like to learn more and also share this information with others, then my book can be purchased through a link on my website, margaretbridgeford.com.au. It's $22 and I'm really keen that the information be shared. Thank you for being part of this Festival of Rural Women, and thank you, Rebel, for inviting me to participate with you all. Preparing this presentation was a thoughtful, reflective experience, and I've greatly appreciated the opportunity to do so. And working out how to use the technology, well, that's a new skill under my belt. And now that I have a website and I now know how to do a video, You never know, there may be more videos coming your way. So check it out. Thank you for letting me share with you my journey. Bye for now.